And we are indeed live on Facebook. And it's a great pleasure today to have a New Jersey Constitutional Republican virtual conversation with Mr. Rupert Darwall and Dr. William Happer. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Good to be joining you, Joe.
A pleasure.
Just a little background on both of these fine gentlemen. Rupert Darwall is a senior fellow at Real Clear Foundation, researching issues from international climate agreements to the integration of environmental, social, and governance, ESG goals in corporate governance. He taught economics and history at Cambridge University and subsequently worked in finance as an investment analyst and in a corporate finance before becoming a special advisor to the United Kingdom's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He has written extensively for publications on both sides of the Atlantic, including The Spectator, Wall Street Journal, National Review, and Daily Telegraph. He is the author of the book, The Age of Global Warming, which we are going to discuss in detail today, and Green Tyranny, and exposing the totalitarian roots of climate industrial complex. And then we have my dear friend, Dr. William Happer here today. And Dr. Happer is an American physicist who is specialized in the study of atomic physics, optics, and spectroscopy. He is the Sirius Fogg Brackett Professor of Physics Emeritus at Princeton University and a long-term member of the Jason Advisory Group. And he has pioneered the development of adaptive optics. Dr. Happer also taught at Columbia University. And again, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Now, I would like to start the program, gentlemen, by showing the book that we are going to be discussing today. And allow me to bring that up. Let's see here. Did have it ready to go. One moment. We're going to talk about the very, very important book that Rupert Darwall has written, and I don't seem to have that up at the moment. Let me see here. It disappeared on me, but anyway, what we're going to do is to talk about the age of global warming. And this book was written 10 years ago, or published 10 years ago, Rupert, and in my estimation, it is the quintessential resource for people to go to learn about the history that makes up this idea of anthropogenic climate change and all of the effects that it's had on the world since its beginning. And as we get started discussing the book, I want to show a quote from the book to get us started, Rupert, and if you would be so kind as to read, let me, one moment. I
you got it there,
right.
Just came up.
Yeah, that was from the, I want to get another one. Let me see here. There we go. And this is in the first chapter, Rupert, entitled The Idea. So if you could read this and then we'll discuss it.
Certainly. The global warming idea is composed of three propositions which proceed from two facts. The first fact is that carbon dioxide is one of a number of so-called greenhouse gases, the most abundant being water vapor. The second is that the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has risen by around 35% from pre-industrial times. The first proposition is about the past. Increased carbon dioxide, together with other greenhouse gases emitted by human activities, has caused global temperatures to rise. In the words of the IPCC's fourth assessment report, quote, "It is likely that there has been a significant anthropogenic warming over the past 50 years over each continent except Antarctica," unquote. The second is about the future. Left unchecked, rising global temperatures will cause immense damage to the environment and humanity. The third proposition is political. Developed countries should lead the world making deep cuts in carbon dioxide emissions, preferably by substituting fossil fuels with renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power.
Excellent. And this is a great introduction to the book. And of course, the whole idea is that of the greenhouse gases, which CO2 is supposed to be leading to, it's considered basically a pollutant. And Will, I want you to talk about the fact that CO2 is a necessary component, element for life.
Well, thanks, JR. Of course, CO2 is not a pollutant at all. It's a vital part of the living world. Plants need it to grow. Plants starve without enough CO2. It's true that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, but it's a very puny one. If you double CO2, it has only about a 1% effect on the cooling radiation from the Earth. So it's very hard to conjure some sort of threat from that. Very likely there will be a very small amount of warming, but it will be good for the world. It'll be mostly at high latitudes where it's already cold, and very little effect near the equator.
Right. And Rupert, this paragraph really sets the whole, it lays down the idea for the book, the preface of the book. And you talk about the political ramifications based upon 2 facts and then 3 propositions. And it's these propositions that have been, are not, and we're going to discuss the fact that they have not been scientifically proven in many aspects. But this is what has led this movement. And the paragraph, these 4 paragraphs really set the tone for what you're going to explain with the history of the age of global warming.
Yeah, I think of the 3 propositions, it's the second and third that are the most relevant. The second one is a proposition about the future. And of course, you can't prove anything about the future. And this is a really, really important point in that we don't know, I mean, just as a matter of fact, well, you can't even talk about a future fact. I mean, the idea of a future fact is kind of nonsensical. And so these are conjectures or speculations riven by uncertainty. And there's something that we simply, as you use the word proof, you cannot prove what will happen in the future because there's no empirical test for something that is yet to occur. So this is a fundamental point. So we're dealing with a category of speculation, and which is very, very seldom that you get any scientist prepared to concede that a future proposition is by its very nature unverifiable. And the third of those 3 propositions is, what should be done about it, is obviously inherently political and takes up quite a bit of the book, because it's basically saying the developed world, the West, through industrialization, which has actually been the only thing that's ever lifted millions of people out of poverty, extended life expectancy. It vastly improved the quality of all our lives. That industrialization, in essence, is the original sin of modern society, and which is based on prodigious use of fossil fuels, and that we should somehow escape from the trap of industrialization, if you like, repeal the sin of industrialization, and that the Western world should take the lead in that, and somehow developing countries which aspire to similar wealth that we've generated for ourselves, developing countries should eschew the path that's made us wealthy.
Yes, and Will, what's the name of the cat? You have a beautiful cat there, a red cat. What's the name of the cat?
Well, his name is Samson, and I either had to let him come or he scratches at the door.
Well, it's good to have Samson with us. I don't think his hair is as long, though, as Samson.
No, that's right.
I have a question for you, Dr. Happer. We're talking about the greenhouse gas effect, right? So
Right.
Common sense, we know that greenhouses have ceilings on them. We know that the greenhouse is usually made up of plastic or it could be made of glass. And that, of course, incubates the air or the atmosphere within that greenhouse. But I would like for you to explain how we can apply this greenhouse effect to the atmosphere, because when we look at the atmosphere and we look up, we see that it's infinitive. It goes off into infinity. As far as we can tell, as far as we can observe, and as far as science tells us, right? So how is this idea of a greenhouse being CO2 causing this warming effect when the atmosphere expands and continually expands up into space? We see the exosphere is at 6,200 miles above Earth. So how do we get around the fact that there's an incubation occurring here?
Well, thanks, JR. This is a great picture, and what it shows are the layers of the atmosphere. We live at the bottom in the troposphere, and in the troposphere, tropom means, churning around, rising and falling from the Greek. And in the troposphere, much of the heat transfer from the ground back to space, the ground is heated by the sun, and that has to go back to space. Much of that is carried by rising and falling packets of air. And it's these turning packets of air that transport the heat. And it really has very little to do with radiation. There is some radiative transfer, but it's mostly convection. And the idea that we've somehow got heat trapping gases that are retaining heat, right where we live and making it intolerably hot it's not scientifically correct. That's actually not how greenhouses work anyway. Greenhouses do have glass in them, but my daughter and I once did a science project when she was in high school where we replaced the glass in a greenhouse with saran wrap, which is completely transparent to infrared radiation. And you couldn't tell the difference between the saran wrap, which was transparent to infrared, and the glass, which is not. So there's an enormous amount of misinformation. The idea is to get the population to think that this is an obvious fact that only idiots don't understand, that, we're being killed by heat trapping gases, but nothing could be further from the truth. So I won't belabor this any longer because we have to get back to Rupert's book, but the comparison is a false comparison, and there is no threat from rising greenhouse gases, either CO2, which is the main one that people produce, or methane, which has been demonized recently. And I should add, in case no one does before me, that the main greenhouse gas by far is water vapor and clouds, which you can see sketched in the troposphere. So I hope the governments don't start regulating water vapor and clouds, although they may try, given how crazy they are.
I think.
Thank you very much, Will, for that.
Will, the analogy with the greenhouse and glass and so forth is quite interesting, because it's John Kerry style science, isn't it? He's talked about a thin layer like a blanket, and of course, as Will says, when in a greenhouse, what you've got is you've got a physical obstacle that stops the convection of hot air moving out of the greenhouse. That's simply what's happened. But there is no physical way of stopping convection, hot air rising. But it's not just politicians like John Kerry who make this mistake. Is one of the leading climate scientists at the Met Office, who was advising Mrs. Thatcher on her speech in the 1980s. He said, "Oh, go and read my book, my primer on climate change." I read it, and there I saw this thing that about the greenhouse, and he actually had a diagram. I was absolutely staggered. So it's not just ignorant politicians who make this mistake.
There's a lot of misinformation that poses as science out there. And if you repeat it enough, a lot of people believe it.
And Rupert, in your book, you go back to the historical precedent set by alarmists, if you will, like Thomas Malthus and William Stanley Jevons, and then Savant Arrhenius, and then Guy Stewart Callender. So speak to their influences on what became what we have today with the alarmism over so-called anthropogenic climate change.
Yeah, I think what you could describe my book as a history of environmentalism, and the founding father of that, although he wouldn't have seen himself as that because it's an ideology that developed over time, was Thomas Malthus, who was an English parson, unmarried, and he wrote at the end of the 18th century, he wrote a book on the principles of population, and his idea was a very simple one. It happened to be a very wrong one, which is that the sources of what we rely on for life, and particularly food, grow arithmetically, whereas the human population has a tendency to grow geometrically. So there's a widening gap between the means of subsistence in the human population, and this would inevitably lead to repeated crises of famine, wars, and disease. And the book was terribly, terribly timed. It was an incredibly important book because it led in 1800, it led to Parliament passing the Census Act, which from 1801 and every 10 subsequent years in Britain there is a census, because such was the alarm caused by a growing population. But he wrote this right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and furthermore, the population of the United Kingdom grew, I think, about fourfold over the course of the 19th century, and living standards rose, and people lived longer lives, and infant mortality fell. And he basically got it completely wrong. And what's interesting is that has not stopped people referring to having these Malthusian fears about there being too many people on the planet. William Stanley Jevons was an incredibly talented and important economist, British economist, second half of the 19th century, and he took the Malthus and he turned it into an argument about energy. And his basic idea was that Britain's prosperity depended on coal. He was right about that coal was fundamental to the growth of the British economy and to rising living standards. But he said we will run out of coal, and this will lead to a permanent diminution in the economy, and the right thing to do would be to shrink the economy. And he had a meeting with the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, who fortunately ignored Jevons' advice, which again has turned out to be totally wrong. Arrhenius, the Swedish scientist, is the first one who people to recognize or to see that there is a greenhouse effect or from carbon dioxide. And he's a Swedish scientist, and interestingly, well, actually it's William Tyndall before that was the guy, William Tyndall, who was an Irish scientist who first identified CO2 as a gas that retained energy. And both he and Arrhenius looked at this issue because they wanted to answer the question, what caused ice ages? And they hypothesized, Canada hypothesized that it was to do with fluctuating levels of carbon dioxide. Now, in the 20th century, Milankovitch came along and actually came up with a far more compelling hypothesis about the cause of ice ages and interglacial periods. We're now in an interglacial, which will be followed by another ice age. And it was to do with, and Will can explain this better, it's to do with the wobble of the Earth's orbit around the sun, and how at high latitudes, the angle of sunlight coming in changes, and this leads to quite a large change in the amount of solar energy hitting the Earth's surface above around 65 degrees. And that is a far more a cogent explanation for ice ages. It's gone into slight retreat because scientists now are completely addicted. They see everything through the prism of CO2. So they argue that the Milankovitch effect actually triggers rises or falls in CO2, and it's actually the CO2 that amplifies what would have the temperature changes. But I'll leave it to Will to explain that better than I can.
Well, if I can jump in, Rupert described Milankovitch cycles perfectly. It's people often don't realize that at midsummer, today or yesterday, the part of the Earth that gets the maximum energy is the North Pole. It seems very surprising, that the daily energy input at the North Pole yesterday was greater than it ever is at the equator. And that's because the sun shines steadily for 24 hours. And so if you work steadily, it's hard to do better than that. So anything that changes the radiation at the North Pole, which these wobbles of the Earth do, can be expected to have a big effect on the Earth. And there is quite a good correlation between the sunshine in the far north and the ice ages. That's quite clear for the last million years or so. It's certainly not the only thing, because the Earth has been wobbling for a long time, but we've not had ice ages forever. There have been long periods, 100 million years, with no ice ages at all. So the idea that any single factor is driving climate, and especially the puny greenhouse gas CO2, is just absurd. It doesn't make any sense. It's not science. I won't say any more about that, but don't be misled.
And Will, let me just ask, as human beings, we breathe in oxygen and then we import CO2, correct?
That's correct.
Now, when we burn hydrocarbons, essentially, isn't that carbon monoxide that comes out of our from burning hydrocarbons?
No. If you run a power plant correctly or automobile correctly, very little carbon monoxide comes out. Almost all is carbon dioxide. You don't want any carbon monoxide coming out, because that still has heating value. So you'd like to burn it, to get your money's worth from the gasoline or the coal. Anything that's coming out is wasted heat.
Right. And
you mentioned Guy Stewart Callender, who was
right.
a very interesting. So I'd just like to touch on him because he's very interesting. He was a British scientist who took on Arrhenius's calculations, and he wanted to work out by how much carbon dioxide would warm the atmosphere. And he was in the 1920s, 1930s. And what's very interesting about this period is that this was a time of rising global temperature. And of course, in the 1930s, the United States experienced the most severe climatic event of its history, namely the Dust Bowl, which was a really severe over a number of years, which had very, very bad consequences for agriculture and so forth. And the question I pose in the book is, why did no one at the time to sort of jump up and down and say, well, it's because of global warming, it's because we've been burning too much coal? Because no one did. No one did then. And so a key idea in the book is that the idea of global warming as a sort of ideology had to be prepared. It wasn't like that people looked at the world around them and said, global warming is happening, because all those factors that could have led people to conclude that global warming was, say, to blame for the Dust Bowl. So imagine if the Dust Bowl happened now. Of course, they would all blame that on global warming and climate change, absolutely unquestionably. But no one did in the 1930s, and they still don't. NASA scientists, there was a study that they don't actually blame it on global warming. So something else has to have happened for the world to be, or scientists and politicians and the elites to be convinced about global warming.
Of course, there's a philosophical aspect, and we've talked about the alarmist aspect that Malthus and Callender and Jevons represent. But in the book, Rupert, you talk about the other position philosophically with science by incorporating the names of Francis Bacon and Karl Popper. So explain the juxtaposition there and the philosophical attitudes towards science.
Yeah, Francis Bacon is commonly sort of seen as the father of, or the grandfather of, the scientific revolution, and he believed in empiricism more or less, and he saw science as not the ultimate, ultimate's not quite the right word, but the branch of knowledge that could do most to improve humanity's well-being. And he went further, and this is the really interesting thing in my view, is that he thought, he basically thought the Commonwealth should be ruled by scientists. That was, which as we can see now would actually be an absolutely terrible idea. And actually he was followed by a sort of generation later by John Locke, who had a huge impact on the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution on the framers. So it was very fortunate that Americans looked to John Locke and not Francis Bacon. As for Karl Popper, he asked himself a very important question: is, you know, what is the difference between science and branches of, I wouldn't call them knowledge, but of inquiry, if you like, which also claim to be scientific. And he looked particularly at Marxism and Freud, and he came up with the axiom that for science needs to make propositions that are falsifiable, that in principle that you can test a statement against nature and it can be proven to be false. And why this is important when it comes to environmentalism is that it's generated lots of propositions, and we started right at the beginning, which are not verifiable. I mean, the key one being that the planet is, if we carry on like this, is going to experience some kind of climatic catastrophe. These are future propositions which by their nature are incapable of being falsified. So when people say, well, this global warming stuff, climate change, the science of climate change hasn't been disproved, well, because it's based on future propositions, it can't be disproved. I mean, you can look at the models and say there are inconsistencies with the way models are being built up and so forth, but in terms of their future propositions, it's inherently unverifiable, unfalsifiable.
Well, Rupert, let me weigh in there just a bit. People made the first climate models a long time ago in the late 80s, early 90s, the last century. And you can look at their predictions, and all of the models are running much too hot. They're predicting far more warming, factors of 3 or more, than is observed. So the warming that's actually being observed is very small, much less than models predict. So many people would say that the models have already been falsified.
Oh, so except through the effluxion of time, you make a future statement, and then of course you get to the future, and that's one of the things that I do in the book. So for example, when Mrs. Thatcher made her famous speech on global warming, which was in 1988, she talked about a degree centigrade a decade, right? And well, it's obvious. So what I did in the book, and I looked at various forecasts of future temperature rise, and the great thing is 2 or 3 decades later one can look at them, and in every single case they over predicted the rise in temperature. And I contrast this at the end of the book with because it was often made, people like Al Gore make the comparison with tobacco, and that fossil fuels are like tobacco and we know it kills them and so forth. What was very interesting that one of the epidemiologists one of the British epidemiologists who first found the link between smoking and lung cancer, in 1952, he made a projection he said, on the basis of these, he said, in 1972, there will be 25,000 people, I think was the number of people who die from lung cancer in Britain. And actually, the actual number turned out to be 26,000, which is an astonishingly accurate prediction. So if you have any doubts about whether smoking is harmful to health, you look at that prediction, and this was completely on the money. And moreover, he hadn't egged it up like climate scientists do. The prediction had come slightly under. So that, to my mind, as a heuristic, that is a very strong indicator of the strength of that scientific finding. By contrast, the predictions of warming, as Will says, are always on the high side. It is very, very. I can't think of one. Perhaps the Russian. There's a Russian model that often is pointed to or comes closest. But on the whole, the models overheat. And it's also worth noting, we talk about in the book, I talk about 1988 being the annus mirabilis of global warming, because that was the date of the Toronto Climate Conference. And in that, it said it explicitly compared climate change to a global nuclear war. Well, come on, guys, let's look at what's happened since 1988. And can anyone say, hand on heart, that we've experienced anything climatically close to a global nuclear war? So it's overheated rhetoric and overheated model forecasts.
1962, Rupert, someone by the name of Rachel Carson wrote a book that's been very, very influential on the anthropogenic climate change movement. How is that so? And Will, do you remember that book called Silent Spring?
Indeed, I do. I read it and I was very moved.
It is. The key thing to recognize about Silent Spring, I'd say two things about it. First of all, I do think it's the single most influential book of the post-war period. I think it had a profound effect on it changed it was the birth of post-war environmentalism. The second thing to recognize about Silent Spring is it is a work of fiction. It really is a work of fiction. The scientific content of that book is virtually zero, as far as, well, I read the whole thing, and it really is. It's sort of like, it's prose poetry. The birds fall dead. There's no. It really is. And I'll add a third thing. There's a chapter in Silent Spring called 1 in 4. And this is because this is about cancer. It used cancer as the big scare, if you remember. And he said, there's nothing we can do to treat cancer because we live in a sea of carcinogens. And this was to do with, because, as I mentioned earlier, that the foundational crime of modern society is the Industrial Revolution. And Rachel Carson was a believer that industrialization and industrial style agriculture causes cancer. And very interestingly, she got this idea from a Pennsylvanian doctor, I think he was in Philadelphia, of German extraction. In the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, he wrote a letter to Berlin asking if he could go to Germany. Where he went to Germany, he still picked up the tenets of Nazi medicine. And a key one of Nazi medicine was industrialization causes cancer. He came back and he was one of the main, if you look at Silent Spring and count the number of citations for Heuper, he's one of the most cited references in that book. So there's a very interesting link between pre-war Nazi Germany and post-war Rachel Carson and Silent Spring.
And also, Rupert, talk to us about Barbara Ward and the idea behind sustainable development.
Barbara Ward was an absolutely brilliant English woman who had a sort of, she was at Oxford, and brilliant economist. In fact, she became, I think, she was a deputy editor, I think, of The Economist at one point. When John F. Kennedy visited London, she took him around. She was incredibly well connected with people in the Kennedy administration, and even more So with Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, basically at one point said hers were the only books he ever read, which is an absolutely staggering thing. I mean, she was the sort of Rachel Carson equivalent on the economic side. She sort of imbibed this environmentalism, and she popularized it. When I say popularized it, she fed it to the elites. And so she was, when the first UN conference on the environment took place in Stockholm in 1972, she wrote it was a French microbiologist whose name has just escaped. Anyhow, they wrote a book about only one planet, and in there they mentioned the threat of climate change, that 2 degrees down and it's an ice age, 2 degrees up and it's a catastrophe, because at that point they believed in things like global cooling. Now, what she imbibed, she was, if you like, one of the chief ideologists, I think that's fair to call her that, of environmentalism. But what came up from that conference was that the developing world, the third world as it was known then, was not really buying this. They didn't want to skip industrialization. And there was an Argentinian economist called Raul Prebisch, who headed UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And that was all about, their thrust was all about industrialization. And so what Barbara Ward had to do was to say, how can we align the interests of the third world with first world environmentalism? And she came up with this notion of sustainable development. And sustainable development basically gives the third world a free pass on industrialization. And so they can do that bit, because poverty alleviation comes first. But the first world, the industrialized world, needs to do all the things that it should do to make itself sustainable. So that's how you came up with the brand name Sustainable Development, which I think incidentally must be one of the most successful branding efforts there's ever been. I mean, sustainable development is everywhere, sustainability and so forth. So she's an incredibly important figure in understanding and in what's happened in subsequent history.
Very good. And I want to share another screen with you gentlemen and discuss this hockey stick. What is the hockey stick, Will and Rupert? And I also want Rupert, if you would describe to us what is Climategate, but start with the hockey stick.
Well, let Rupert discuss it, because he's closer to the general population than I am.
The hockey stick was an incredibly important tool, if you like, informational tool that was used by the IPCC in its third assessment report. And what it purported to show was that there had been a trend of declining temperature for 1,000 years or more, and suddenly, as industrialization took root, a sharp uptick in temperature. And this was persuaded many scientists, it has many scientists, that actually they'd found, if you like, the smoking gun of climate change. It was the best demonstration that here was the evidence that of the Industrial Revolution, and CO2 was heating the atmosphere. And what then happened was a Canadian oil engineer by the name of Steve McIntyre started asking Michael Mann, who came up with this, who developed this, he asked him a number of questions, but he just didn't seem plausible to him. And the more, it was like he was pulling a bit of string, and the whole thing started to unravel. And it's actually the internet that made this all possible, because it started a huge debate on the internet, and the climate scientist fraternity, the climate priesthood, was very very aghast at what was going on. Now, a lot of the data for this was held at the University of East Anglia and its climatic research unit. And in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009, that was one of those UN climate conferences that was going to save the world. We've had quite a number of those, but this one was really going to save the world. And in the lead up to it, the climatic research unit's server was hacked, and a lot of emails were then put out onto the internet. And what was very interesting about this episode was that the doubts that Steve McIntyre had explored and generated were actually shared by a number of scientists. And so what we were discovering is what climate scientists were saying in public was very different from what they were saying privately to each other. And furthermore, what the email showed was a determined attempt by the paleoclimate community to stop people with scientists with papers who argue differently from what had become the orthodoxy from being published in peer-reviewed publications, because we hear the whole time the only thing that passed muster in this field is what's in peer review. So if you police the gates to peer review publication, you actually decide what is peer reviewed, and you therefore decide what science is, which is a profoundly anti-scientific notion, but that is the nature of modern science. So yes, this was a scandal. It blew the lid on how climate scientists behave, and also it blew the lid on what they really happen to think about the data.
And at the time that came out, Will, what was your thoughts on the hockey stick?
Well, I think most scientists who had paid attention to this area before were shocked, because it was well known that similar curves had been prepared by Hubert Lamb, who actually, I think, founded the East Anglia Institute. And his curves were in the first IPCC report, and it showed a very clear climate optimum around the year 1000, 1100, 1200, when Greenland was settled by Norse farmers, and arable crop areas expanded everywhere in the far north. So it was completely opposite of what most people thought was well-established facts. So I guess my reaction is, how did this famous play where, someone questions the doctor about, where the liver is in the body, and, it seems to be on the wrong side of the body. And he said, it's a French play, nous avons changé tout cela. We've changed all that, right? So that was my reaction to it.
Yeah, I think what Will said, because there was, in previous, as he points out about Hubert Lamb, there was this period known as the medieval warm period. And this was a problem for climate change as a catastrophe, because if you think of, there'd actually been a period in fairly recent history when temperatures are the same or even higher than they are today, and yet civilization flourished. You think of the High Middle Ages and so forth. This is a problem, and what the hockey stick did was deal with that problem basically by removing it altogether, as that French surgeon did with the liver. It kind of just disappeared. There's actually quite a neat trick for any climate scientist who disputes the medieval warm period, that a cousin of someone like Eric the Red, some Viking guy, he had a cousin who swam across a fjord in Greenland, right? And it was a mile or two across. You think, well, you could challenge any climate scientist who doesn't believe in the medieval warm period to swim across that fjord and see how well they do, because the Vikings did that.
And Rupert, just to go back for a moment, talk about why 1988 you consider to be essentially the beginning of the age of the thought on anthropogenic climate change or global warming.
Yeah, there's a sort of, if you like, you need to look at the context, first of all, the geopolitical context which is actually relevant to today, of what was happening in 1988. Was the last year of the Reagan presidency. He had put in, at the behest of the, in fact, the West Germans, one forgets this, put in cruise and Pershing missiles in response to the Soviet SS-20s, and Gorbachev had concluded that the Soviet Union wasn't going to win the Cold War, and there was this period of rapid de-escalation in Cold War tensions, and you have the signature of the INF Treaty, which Will, I'm sure, could speak more about than I can. So you had this rapid reduction in geopolitical tension. And then in the summer of that year, you had James Hansen, the NASA scientist, did his famous testimony to the Senate, where the rooms, they chose what they hoped would be the hottest day of the year. They kept the windows closed, and he was drenched in sweat as he gave his testimony, saying the greenhouse gas has been detected. It was the front page of the New York Times. And you also had the G7 meeting actually put global warming was in the communique, and shortly after the G7 in Toronto, you had the Toronto Climate Conference, when you had Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Premier of Norway, and together with Brian Mulroney hosted that. Now, Brundtland was really important because she was very close to Barbara Ward, and she had done a report on sustainability, on sustainable development. And the whole notion of sustainable development then got pushed forward into that G7 communique. And so you had the Toronto Climate Conference that said global climate change will be second only to global nuclear warfare and its catastrophic effects. And then in the autumn, you have Margaret Thatcher chime in a very famous speech she made to the Royal Society, saying this is the biggest issue facing us. So for that really kicked the whole thing off. And then in the autumn of that year, you had the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So all these things were coming together.
Right, and it's very, it seems remarkable to many American conservatives who revere the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, the great conservative Prime Minister of England, as being, she really was an advocate for this idea of anthropogenic climate change right from the very beginning. And of course, she, like Prince Charles has been a world-renowned advocate for it. And I think it's interesting that I heard you mention, Rupert, that Prince Philip, who was a very ardent conservationist and preservationist in the early days, in the early part of the 20th century, repudiated what happened in the 60s, which he thought was a militant aspect to environmentalism. But it's surprising that conservatives who we consider to be, who we revere, like Margaret Thatcher, and even Prince Charles to a degree, bought the anthropogenic climate change science from the start, or pseudo-science.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher, I think what was happening there was that she was a scientist. She read chemistry at Oxford. She saw herself as a scientist, the lone scientist in her own cabinet. She thought she had a very great respect for scientists, and she kind of, because of that, she kind of bought into what scientists were telling her about it. And she was advised by, actually was a guy out of the Foreign Office, Crispin Tickell, who sort of sold her a lot of this thing. And she was going to make a big speech to the Royal Society. She asked Crispin Tickell what it should be on. He said, climate change, global warming. And so she picked that up and ran with it. And she got advice from the Met Office on it, and she really believed it. And not only that, when Gro Harlem Brundtland launched her development commission on sustainable development, there's a photo of Gro Harlem Brundtland and Margaret Thatcher on the steps of Number 10, and she she bought into the politics of it, of sustainable development. So, and she made I think it was her last speech to the United Nations General Assembly. She went on about, you know, the fable about the Easter Islanders who cut down the trees and therefore starved to death or whatever. And that's what was going to happen to the industrialized world. It's complete garbage. I mean, but she really, there's no question that she believed this. She talked about it, and it happens to be one of the very few big issues that I think she got completely and utterly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I would add that I think on this issue, Ronald Reagan was a hell of a lot better. I mean, he understood this. He really, really understood it, and there's a big difference between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher on these kind of issues.
Right. And the other thing, Rupert, that you brought out in the book that I thought was very, very significant is the fact that as governor of the state of California, Ronald Reagan was very much considered an advocate for the environment, and made several different important acts that indicated his dedication to preservation and environmentalism.
Well, I would make a distinction between environmentalism and conservationism. I think they're very different. They're a very, very different philosophy behind them. Conservationism is about preserving habitats, preserving wildlife. It's actually what Prince Philip, you mentioned Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was into. Environmentalism is an ideology which basically says that it's profoundly hostile to industrialization, economic growth, human flourishing. And Ronald Reagan was, in that sense, he was never an environmentalist, and he kind of repudiated that kind of thing. He did that. He did a really brilliant radio talk, because you know there's a book of his radio speeches, and he said. It sort of begins like, would you like to have one of those flying lizards from dinosaurs land in your backyard? And he was having a go at the idea that every single species should be protected for all time, and protected to the extent that you can't build anything or do anything. So I think he had a love of nature. And he was also a pragmatist. He believed in economic development and human flourishing. And I think he strikes the right balance. I think he's someone we can learn from.
And here I have included a fact sheet timeline. Of course, Rupert, you go into great detail talking about the various conferences. And of course, 1988, here we have the beginning, as you indicate in the book, this IPCC fact sheet. And we'll have a link posted to this so that people can look at this. But Rupert, you go into great detail in each one of these conferences prior to 2013. And there's a lot of information here. And one of the barometers by which they gauge and they give these assessment reports was on the information regarding the amount of weight or tonnage of CO2 in the atmosphere. And what is the methodology that is involved with being able to measure how much CO2 is actually in the atmosphere?
Well, the hero of those measurements in the modern time was a guy named Keeling, who was a scientist at Scripps Institute in San Diego. And he developed a way to use absorption of infrared radiation by CO2 gas in the air to determine how much was there. It was a very clever method, and it was first set up in Hawaii on one of the volcanoes, and has been going since the late 50s. And so the way you measure it is you let CO2 get into a beam of infrared radiation, and then you see how much that attenuates absorbs the radiation, and then you convert that to a figure. You have to calibrate it. So all of this is very delicate and important work that needs to be done carefully. But you can buy a CO2 meter over the internet, which is pretty good, and I have one. I often take it out into my backyard just out of curiosity to see what CO2 levels are. And here in Princeton, where I live, CO2 levels drop down to around 300 parts per million in the late afternoon of a sunny day. And they get up to 500, 600 by dawn the next day because of the plants absorbing and then re-emitting CO2. And so this just points out that CO2 is always varying, at least at ground level. You talked about us emitting CO2. Each human being exhales about 2 pounds of CO2 a day. So with 8 billion people, that's a lot of CO2 being respired. So you have to wonder, should we really demonize a gas that all of us emit? You know, if you want to get rid of the gas, maybe you should get rid of humans. And in fact, if you scratch some environmentalists, that's really what they seem to want.
That's very true, Will. I just want to share another share screen, and I'd like to have Rupert read this portion of the book, which I think is very, very significant. On page 100, Rupert, if you could read this, I think it'll be very enlightening for the audience.
The purpose of consensus is to gain agreement with a view to taking collective action. Here, an altogether larger claim is being made. Consensus can transform belief into knowledge. This requires us to accept there is no fundamental difference between belief and knowledge, so long as there is collective agreement on it by those whose opinions count, the experts who don the mantle of scientific authority. In this way, today's scientists have become modern-day alchemists, transforming the lead of subjective belief into the gold of objective knowledge. Such a claim has profound implications for the nature of science itself. It permits scientists to slip the bounds of what had traditionally been understood as science, not pseudoscience, to adopt Popper's term, and into the realms of futurology. For eminent scientists can make more of an impact on the popular imagination with their essays in futurology than with their scientific research.
I thought that was a very significant portion of the book, Rupert. And Will, it reminds me of the idea that often the consensus isn't necessarily the basis of all truth. It reminds me of in 1 Kings, we read of the prophet Elijah, one man going up against the 500 prophets of Baal, and Isaiah, or rather Elijah, won the day and was speaking in truth. And of course, we can't base truth on consensus, correct?
That's right. Another more modern example is Einstein's theories were rejected by many people. And so some of his enemies organized an entire journal with refutations of Einstein. And there were 100 papers in the journal, all of them, dumping on Einstein's theories. And so the title was 100 Authors Against Einstein, 100 Autoren gegen Einstein. And when Einstein heard about this, he said, well, why did they need 100? If I were wrong, one would have been enough. I think of him often, he spent his last years here in Princeton, and we're still sort of haunted by his spirit.
And probably forever will be. But Rupert just discussed that. Try to give us another insight on that very, very important quote that you gave us there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the conclusions I came to in writing the book was how the nature of science has changed, because ultimately, I suppose I was saying that it's up to scientists to define what their branch of knowledge. And if they slip the bounds of empiricism and falsifiability to basically to base what is accepted knowledge on consensus, there's no difference between that and the so-called social sciences, which are, I think, for many reasons, regarded as inferior branches of knowledge. And it's this if you like, a convergence of the hard physical sciences, what used to be regarded as hard physical sciences, towards convergence with social sciences, which are seemed as softer and more prone to ideology. That is a trend that has become increasingly pronounced, and it's the ideological component that has become the. Where I end up in the book is to suggest that environmentalism is an ideology that is similar to Marxism in that it has a scientific component, but it also has an ideological component. And often with a scientist, a climate scientist, they are both activists and scientists, and you can't pull the two apart. And therefore, it puts one in the position that you have to deploy very great skepticism to any claim they make, that you shouldn't take it at face value. You need to investigate it yourself and test it yourself, because it is like a sort of Marxist economist. You say, well, kind of, where are they coming from on this? Why are they telling me this?
Right, and in the book, Rupert, you mentioned dendrochronology. And Will, could you explain what dendrochronology is and the relevance to it is in understanding climate?
Yes, how temperature is changing along with CO2 is a very, very important issue. And for the last 100 years, we have measurements and they're pretty good, so we know temperature. But if you go back 200, 300, 400 years, there were no thermometers, or there were just a few of them. So there was no way to know what the temperature was in the year 1400 or 1200 or earlier. And so one way to try to estimate that is to saw a tree across, and you look at the growth rings in the stem of the tree. And the idea is that if it's a nice warm summer, the tree grows a lot and it'll have a wide growth ring. And if it's a dry summer or a cool summer, it'll be narrower. And I had a slip of the tongue there because all sorts of things affect the width of the ring, whether it's a wet summer or a dry summer. So how to disentangle the influence of temperature on the ring width is a very tricky question. But anyway, dendrochronology was a key part of the Michael Mann hockey stick. And if you look carefully into it, as Stephen McIntyre did, you see that there was a lot of data selection and rejection in order to get the desired answer, which was that we've had an unprecedented warming in the last 100 years that can only be explained by CO2. That's certainly very, very questionable. I personally think it's dead wrong.
Well, the other thing about the Michael Mann hockey stick is that he used an algorithm to center the data that automatically produces hockey stick shapes, and that was found. And he's never revealed the algorithm, but Steve McIntyre and a colleague of his basically sort of synthesized it, and you can get a hockey stick out of random data. So that was, the hockey stick is an absolute, it's a poster child of what's gone wrong in science. And the fact that Michael Mann is so, is one of the world's leading climate scientists who the media goes to whenever they want to comment, actually says a lot about the integrity of climate science as a discipline.
I agree.
And also in the book, Rupert, you make mention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And of course, he gave a great address prior to his leaving the White House. And he said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." And what we can do, Rupert and Will, we could replace the military industrial complex with what Rupert has described as the global warming industrial complex. Please speak to that if you would.
Let me just say that, that quote, that speech also has a similar warning against a scientific technological complex. People don't like to say that. The media won't show it to you, but if you read the speech, you can find it. So Eisenhower was perfectly aware and very alarmed about the possibilities of the scientific establishment, going rogue, which it has in the case of climate.
Yeah, let me get you. Where was it? So, yeah, he will. Actually, there's a quote, and there's a very famous quote which I can't get off the top of my head from the book, where he actually talks about scientists being in federal employ and how dangerous that would be.
Yes.
I can't find it off the top of my head, but it's an incredibly important. I mean, that farewell speech of Eisenhower's is quite remarkable, and his warning against scientists being in federal employ is profound. I mean, it's very interesting. How did he, why did he come up? What was the thing that was worrying him? Because it's come to pass, basically.
Yeah, it's the old problem, that, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And for many, many scientists today, their treasure comes from federal grants. And to get the grant, you have to support whatever the narrative happens to be. If the narrative is wrong, you still support it.
Yeah, let me get this for you.
Yeah, I hope you can find that, Rupert. I should have posted that as well as on the share screen, that specific quote that you found that you give in the book.
Right, here it comes. The farewell address, this is 17th of January, 1961. In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. Incredible, isn't it?
It is. His speech, President Eisenhower's speech almost reminds me of Washington's farewell. It had so much impact and has rung so true after decades of evidence.
Yeah, I think part of the reason Einstein was so wise on his assessment of science was that he was a very close friend of my old mentor at Columbia, Robbie. Robbie was a street smarts little New Yorker, and he had seen it all. He was also a very, very good scientist. But when Eisenhower was president of Columbia University, he and Robbie were very close. And so whenever Eisenhower wanted scientific advice, he would call up Robbie, and Robbie could call the White House, and Eisenhower would pick up the phone. So I've heard Robbie often express the sentiments that were in the farewell address. And so I'm guessing that he wrote that paragraph. I don't know for sure who wrote it, but that's my guess.
And as we wind down, gentlemen, I think it's important that, and of course, Rupert discusses this in the book, but the impact that the Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA, 549 US 497 in 2007, the impact that it had, and that was because the Supreme Court found that the Environmental Protection Agency, which incidentally was created by President Nixon, can regulate greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, and in the opinions, clarified carbon dioxide as air pollutant. And what a disastrous
yeah, what I think that what that did was it enabled the EPA, should it file an endangerment finding, which it did under the Obama administration, that CO2 would fit into what I think one of the justices called the capacious definition of pollutant. And as I point out in the book, and will implied as well, is that water vapor would also fit into the capacious definition of pollutant. So basically anything can be called a pollutant if you can come up with an endangerment finding.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually
And,
something, I mean, we can perhaps talk another time, but that EPA endangerment finding is endangered, really. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read it, just how thin it was, apart from anything. Well mixed, actually, it was well mixed greenhouse gases from memory. It wasn't CO2, it's well mixed greenhouse gases.
And also you discuss, Rupert, the opprobrium of something that both of you gentlemen are aware of, and that's the criticism of those who would be called or who are labeled climate deniers or climate contrarians as yourself. And I think that really the category that gentlemen like yourself should be entered or identified with is climate clarifiers. You're clarifying and you're asking that the science be rigorously applied. And climate clarifiers, to me, is a much more accurate description of what you gentlemen do.
I think the whole denier thing, as well, apart from being distasteful, which it is a sign that this is an ideology. Because and I quote a lot on Popper on this, because Popper said when he was finding his way to defining the difference between science and pseudoscience and the ideology that's attached to pseudoscience, he talks about how a young Nazi guy said, he had this argument, and he said, I don't argue, this guy said, I don't argue, I shoot. And and this is where both scientific inquiry and democratic politics are completely aligned. And that is about the importance of argument and debate. And along with that comes respect. And what the climate denier thing is about is saying there is no debate, and that so-called climate deniers have seen the truth, but they deny the truth either because they've been paid to or because they're inherently evil people. And it's a way of avoiding debate. And debate is the lifeblood of both science and of democratic politics. So it is a very, very, very big threat to not just the advance of scientific knowledge, but actually to democratic politics and constitutionalism.
Yeah, let me just add that part of the reason I think they use this denier meme is that their scientific case is so weak that they lose every honest debate. You know, they come away looking like absolute clowns. And so they learned a long time ago that it's better not to debate, and it's better to simply smear your opponents.
And relevant to this discussion, current discussion, here's an article called Climate McCarthyism. It's published by Jordan McGillis on June the 17th this year in the City Journal. I just want to read a quote for you gentlemen that is indicative of the political nature of those who are looking to look at the accurate science that's involved with the so-called idea or pseudoscience of anthropogenic climate change. But here's a quote. This is not the first time Democrats have used their cudgel to pressure social media companies to stifle dissent on climate. In 2020, Senators Elizabeth Warren, Brian Schatz, Tom Carper from Delaware nearby, and Sheldon Whitehouse penned an open letter to Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, calling on the company to toe the Democratic Party line. Quote, if Facebook is truly committed to fighting the spread of false news on Facebook and Instagram, the senators wrote, the company must immediately acknowledge in its fact-checking process that the climate crisis is not a matter of opinion and act to close loopholes that allow climate disinformation to spread on its platform, unquote. And gentlemen, we are, of course, giving this conversation today on the medium of Facebook. So I certainly hope that we're not booted off.
Yeah, I think this is quite a relatively new development, and it particularly came as a result of COVID, where the public health authorities didn't want their view and their prescription of of public health measures to be challenged or questioned or whatever. And so it is an extension of what we saw over the last couple of years or so, that, and it's a very dangerous, it's incredibly dangerous to suppress debate. And furthermore, it will create, in some form or other, it will create a backlash, which will be damaging. I mean, democratic debate is absolutely essential, and suppress it, there will be consequences that will be bad in one way, in one form or another.
That's right. And of course, it's important that the First Amendment rights of the freedom of speech and freedom of press are maintained, which these are examples of the Biden administration trying to subvert by influencing technical companies and tech companies in suppressing speech, which if they took our particular program off today would be a clear violation of. As we finish up, gentlemen, I want to.
Yeah.
No,
So
go
I was just
ahead,
going to say, the
Rupert,
First
please.
Amendment is the one that everything else depends upon.
Mhm. No question about it. And towards the end of the book, actually, the second to the next page, you do an excellent summary. And Rupert, I want the audience to know that it's important that they buy the book, because we're just scratching the surface, but it's so well written. It was a real pleasure to read right from the beginning. And the last chapter, Reflections, is an excellent summary of everything that you covered in the book. And look at this. Who was it who said that essence is or brevity is the essence of wit? Wasn't that Shakespeare, Rupert? And this sentence is clearly indicative of that.
No, that I don't know who said that. Yes, the science is weak, but the idea is strong. I think that's having written, you get ideas as you write a book, you kind of, the ideas actually germinate and actually distill. So that is, as you say, that's just distilled down.
I second the recommendation. This is a very good book, and anyone listening, please read it if you get a chance.
Absolutely. And before we go, I do want to show one more graph, if I could. That is a perfect example, a real world example of what we're talking about, of the dangers of believing in this pseudoscience. And that would, here we go right here. And that would play out in the state of New Jersey, Rupert, which of course is where the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans are derived from. But what has happened over the last, I've talked to Will about this, is the fact that the total annual cost of New Jersey's primary solar subsidies, this is the subsidies that the state, through taxpayer generated dollars, has subsidized the wind and solar initiatives by a tune of $600 million a year. And this was in 2018. It's gone down a little bit since then because of the effects of the COVID-19 lockdowns. But over $600 million has been spent in subsidizing solar, which only produces a pittance, Rupert, of the power generated by the state of New Jersey. And an example of government intervention, in order to correct, because of the market abnormality created by these subsidies, they've had to subsidize nuclear, which by itself produces practically 100% of our clean emissions, if you will. And yet this amount of money it's like the corrective action is toppled by another corrective action. Another one is government intervenes in the market economy, and it costs the taxpayers. And it's all a result of this idea that the atmosphere and that is warming, and that we have an existential threat with global warming. And yet we see, and I've heard you say that this whole idea of anthropogenic climate change robs the local and benefit of the whole. And here in New Jersey is a perfect example. $600 million in solar subsidies that doesn't produce the power. And because of the abnormality created in the market, they have to subsidize nuclear, which by itself would stand alone without any need for help.
No, it's outrageous. You know, I like to call it the inverse Robin Hood strategy. You rob from the poor to give to the rich. And so, the people invested in solar companies get even richer. And the poor guy who has to drive to work, with more expensive gasoline or pay more for his electrical bill, which you do, the more renewables, the more you pay for electricity. He pays the bill. So, so it's profoundly unjust.
Right. And of course, Rupert, that's an example of what your book indicates here with the whole history behind the anthropogenic. And anthropogenic means man-made climate change, saying that we are contributing to the climate. And I hope that everyone got something from this today. And allow me one more time, Rupert, to see if I could bring up your fine book so that people can see it. I saw it listed. There it is right there. There it is, Rupert, The Age of Global Warming, A History, paperback. I would recommend. There's only one left in stock at the moment, Rupert. So we need to get a hold of Amazon and tell them to stock more copies. And this is a book that will be well worth your investment, so that you're able to become educated on this topic. And I hope today's program will help you learn more about this idea. And there are a lot of our representatives, gentlemen, and a lot of our citizens are swallowing hook, line, and sinker this idea of anthropogenic climate change. And we've clearly shown through the history that Rupert has provided with us and the insight of Dr. Happer that it is based on pseudoscience and not truth. Well, I want to thank you, gentlemen. And this is what we're considering part one of our conversation. Next time, we'll have Rupert and Dr. Happer back to discuss Rupert's book on green tyranny and the fine paper that he wrote on ESG, which is something that's very, very important. And I know, Rupert, you're dedicating a lot of time to that now. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So it's very important that you join us again, and please share this video. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your time, and remember, as we conclude our program, I thank you very much for joining me. But remember what Lincoln said. He said, liberty for all. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.